Ollie, thanks very much for the question about how we are using spacing. So, question on Twitter was, are you using default bottom margin variables from the MAST framework for headings paragraphs, or using something else like spacer divs or parent element gap? Great question. We use a combination of both, and we are playing around with it just purely because we're playing around with variants and how it all works, and in the context of the new build mode. So this is in the context of obviously us building a site for the client, but also for the client being familiar with how things work on their end. So obviously we can use margin. There's lots of benefits for using margin. You know, they collapse in on each other. Apart from in Flex, which can be a bit of a stumbling block. The wrap and padding approach, which is you wrap an element in a div and put padding or top and bottom of the wrapper div. You've got the spacer approach, which is using a single div with some padding in it, and that gives a space between two elements. Pros and cons. And then you've got obviously the flex gap approach, which is sort of more modern CSS, but it's a little bit trickier to be creative with that in terms of the flex gap is generally the same between elements in the same parent element. So the way we do it, or the way I've sort of kind of set it up really here is with a spacer component. So previously I would have had lots of different spacer components. So when I search for a spacer, I go, oh, spacer large, spacer medium. And whilst that was good, it was a little bit fiddly. And it wasn't as clear cut for the client either. So what we've done now is just created a component called spacer, and we've just given it a load of variants. So you can see here exactly the same. If I look at the navigator here, we've got spacer, 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 and that spacer then has variants. So we've got small, medium, large, XL, XL, XXL. So you can see the spacer changing there, which is pretty cool. You know, it plays into that idea of Webflow being a visual development tool. So I've got these here, just different variants. And these, if we dive into how it's set up, is essentially just a div with a class of spacer, and then the base. So this is the base variant. You have component. As soon as you've got component variants, you have a base, and this is the base. It's a little bit misleading. Maybe it should say base here, or at least have the name of the base, because it can be a little bit misleading here. But we've got the idea here that we've put some. I've got some spacing variables here. Let's have a look at all the spacing variables. So I've got all these, and they're all attached to pixel variables, which I use fluid responsive for. So these are fluid responsive variables here. So, it could be 16 pixels on my desktop, but then it goes down to mobile, maybe goes down to 12 pixels, and it goes nice and on a little consistent graph as it gets smaller. The idea being that as everything shrinks, everything shrinks. So the relationships start kind of respect each other. There are different ways to do it. But yeah, the idea is that each of these variants has a different variable. So if I look at MD size, and you can see here now it shows MD size here. I'm not sure why it doesn't show SM size, because I've given it a name. And this just links to a different variable, the medium size, and this links to XL, for example. So if we wanted to set up, like, let's go giant size, and in this giant size we might want to put, do you know what, I'm going to go 144 pixels, huge one. So this isn't even attached to a spacing variable, so I wouldn't recommend going straight to the sizes, because it kind of breaks that relationship, that nice clear systemized relationship you have. But that's now set up as a variant, so it's not like you have to set forget. It's just this component now across all the components. So if I go to here now, this has giant available to it. So we've got different elements. Yeah, so that's the way variants work with the spacer. And how I use it here is just, for example, here I've got a content slot. Now this content slot actually has a standardized flex gap in it. And why do I put that in? Well, I've got a consistent spacing design where, eyebrow, then the heading, then the paragraph. And these have no bottom margin on them. So they would come with, in MAST, they would come with bottom margin, but with heading text here, I've removed all the margin. And if you look at, this one isn't a H1 here, but you can see that. Let's have a look at this one, see if I can select the paragraph here. So I've removed that and put that as 0 here. What I've also done, a little tip from Timothy Ricks, was to trim the line height as well. Sometimes when you've got the line height, even if you're playing around with a really good line height, so when it folds down onto another line, you'll get that little bit of increase at the top and increase at the bottom, and that can play around with the spacing. So if you can see here, I've sort of trimmed it a little bit so it's as tight as possible to the top and to the bottom of this font. Yeah, so that's how I do it. And then I've got a spacer div sitting in here. Then with the columns, obviously we have, if I was to look at the column grid here, is each col is using, we have to put a calc in here is using the main gap variable. So this is actually set I think to 40 pixels at the moment. Again, it's the 40 pixels is referring to my sizes, which are fluid responsive, so that will get smaller. And then that's divided by 2, so it's just the 20 pixels to start with. That's on both sides. And that means I can roll that out across my rows, my columns, and I can even use it. I could theoretically, I suppose, use those variables in my spacing system or spacer system if I wanted to as well. So yeah, hopefully that gives an insight into what we're playing around with at the moment. Now, it's not to say it's going to stay like this. I think there are instances where wraps with padding, especially maybe not wraps with padding, but margin is going to be super useful, especially with the idea that they collapse in on each other. So a bottom margin of one element will collapse in on top margin of another. So you don't get that double margin effect, which is really smart property of CSS anyway. But in the context of build mode, this feels like a nice, very obvious way for a client to say, do you know what? I need a bit more spacing here. Now, I'm not saying straight away that clients should be playing around with the design too much, but it just gives them a little bit of a wall garden and saying, look, these are the options. Don't go and type in, 29 pixels into the margin or the spacer, because that tends to cause chaos, as we all know. So yeah, hopefully that helps, Ollie, and thanks for the question. Keep them coming.